What are some possible causes for much weaker front squat versus my back squat? And number one is just having very, very weak legs. Number two is being bad at front squatting and not practicing the front squat. And then number three, I would say, is like your overall squat mechanics could just be pushing you more towards a back squat than it would be towards a front squat.
So obviously, number one is just not doing enough front squats. So a lot of times people just, for example, if you saw Hayden's, you saw his fucking, he maxed out his front squat the week after he kind of did all his maxes, and he maxed out on his front squat. So he did, his old PB was like 170, and he hit 160, it was very easy. He went to 180 and failed it incredibly miserably.
I did a front squat. So my old front squat max was 175. So I thought I'd beat that easy with all the squatting. Here's 160, fairly easy. Then I jumped to 180 and failed, which was weird. I thought all of the back squat gains, like 50 kilos added to my back squat, almost would have transferred to front squat, but apparently it doesn't.
Might not even made 170. So even if your back squat could be very strong, your front squat could be limited by lack of practice, poor technique, poor mobility, or poor upper body strength, for example. So lack of core strength, upper back strength, mid back strength, and you may also, less likely, but possible, is just not very well built for front squats also, but that's a less likely scenario. Should I program squats on their own separately to my weightlifting program if I need to really focus on my squat? So, Gillian, I don't know if you've ever seen Project Chavez, where he says things like, now that's not a great question. This, I suppose...
Project would say, now that's a dumb question.
Asshole and get ruthlessly sore and not be able to sit on the fucking shitter and just that level of fuck for a year or 2 years or 5 years. 90% of the assholes that run out and buy a satchel of Dianabol to look good at the beach, 90% of those assholes would just weed themselves out.
But it's not a dumb question, Killian, just before
Gareth is calling out, like,
before I accuse you of that. I think the issue there is when you say, program squats on their own. I know what you mean, but it sounds like you're saying, it's all part of the program, even if you don't kind of do it concurrently. So, like, what you're kind of saying, I suppose, is, what you probably should be asking is, should I hyper focus on squats to the detriment of my lifts if I need to focus on my squat? Now, there's kind of like two scenarios that usually beginner to intermediate lifters will end up in this. It will be either you are not able to both bring up your lifts and your squats, or you'll make the conscious decision to put yourself into a scenario where you're doing a very, very distinct strength phase. Now, usually what happens is most people should be well able for bringing up your squats and your lifts at the same time if your programming is smart. I'd say 90% of our lifters will always be progressing their snatch, their clean and jerk, and their squat, unless they're coming up to competition. But for other training blocks, and they're always progressing through, you can very, very feasibly bring up your squat and your snatch and clean and jerk at the same time. I don't think you should ever really, more than once a year, really focus on a hyper strength phase where you're just to the detriment of your snatch and your clean and jerk. Bring up your squats by themselves, as oftentimes you still need to hyper develop your ability to do the skills of the snatch, clean, jerk, because most people in these scenarios don't have that skill set developed very well. You don't have that. Something I didn't get only until, honestly, the last few months, and it's been nearly a decade of weightlifting, was something. It just takes time to learn how the lifts feel. Like, it takes so long to really get what the lift feels like, and I can only describe the feeling in my head. It's like an amorphous cloud in my head of what that means, but when I say it out loud, it doesn't make as much sense. And I've heard Luz Aujon talk about this in some interviews, saying, he knows what it should feel like now.
As I got older, especially once I hit 30, I started focusing more on the sensation of the techniques and how the lift should feel. I tended to rely on my absolute strength to make lifts when I was younger. That's because I believe that strength is 70% to 80% of the key to success. I think that is part of the reason why I used to be a bit more inconsistent and even felt a bit confused while lifting on the competition platform. But for now, I'm on a whole new level because of my technique, and my intention is always to push towards perfection, technically. Confused now and more confident when lifting on the platform thanks to my comprehensive understanding of all the technical details.
Gabriel has talked about it. He said like every year you lift, you learn more than the last year. And I'm always thinking about this. And it's only recently that I've really figured out what the lift should feel like. But this took such a long time. And it's such a hard concept. It sounds so simple, but it takes so long for you to figure it out. What you're really looking for is how did the lift feel without you consciously thinking about it. And I don't really think for most lifters, bar maybe once a year for maybe a 6 to 8 week period, should you really pull yourself away from the lifts to focus on squats. You should realistically be able to push both of them. The only scenario I'd say is if you're looking at clean and jerking 120, right, and your front squat is like 120 for a single or a double or something, then I think there's a reasonable time to give there's a reasonable argument there to put yourself in a scenario where you kind of start off your squat, but where you focus on that squat. But in that scenario, you're literally giving yourself a head start in your squat to bring back in the lifts and then keep progressing both of them. So very rarely would you put yourself in a position where you are progressing your snatch and not progressing your squat, and then you progress your squat and your snatch. Very, very rarely does that ever happen. We're always trying to look to do both of those. So some scenarios, I've had a lifter or two where we just needed to give them a couple of weeks to hammer some squats for a couple of weeks, and then we bring back in their lifts, and then we keep progressing their squats. So it's like a way of just getting a little kickstarter because they're not as good as they could be at squats, but then we'll always progress in with the idea that we're trying to progress both of them. So very rarely, I think, is it productive for amateur intermediate lifters to take a load of time out and just focus on their squat other than for a few weeks of the year. But that then is with the idea that you're going back and hammering a load of the lifts and the squats at the same time for the rest of the year. So I'd say be very, very cautious with ever taking away a lot of time from the snatch and clean and jerk for your squats, when if you're smart about it, you can very, very feasibly progress both of them at the same time.
Erico Oliveira says, how should I structure training after having peaked for 2 of my lift, bench and deadlifts, but still make great progress in the squats?
Just reset them. That's what I've done.
Back to volume.
And you can keep progressing one of them. Sometimes it does happen by accident, I suppose. It's kind of poor planning, but it happens. Or not even poor planning, but sometimes it just, someone will, especially it happens a lot in beginners actually, or intermediate lifters, where they'll, like you said, you're really good at your bench and deadlifts, so or you're not as good at those actually, I should say. So though you go to your natural progressions, you're getting to your 5s and your 3s and stuff, and you get to the end of that progression, but you find in your squat that you might be naturally good at your squatting, Erico. You get to week 8 for all of those lifts, but you find that in your squat you just have an extra 2 weeks of progression left to go. You could definitely keep going with them. I always just get people to keep going with that, and then what we kind of do usually it ends up not being more than a week or 2 left in the progression, maybe 2 weeks at the most. So what I do is just kind of simmer those other 2 lifts, keep that peak going for your squat, for example, peak that out, and then reset everything else, and then try next time to get things peaking together. But it's not a huge deal when you're kind of early stage, beginner, intermediate. It does happen. That was a good question, actually.